So this bill, HR 9495, has endured fierce criticism from the nonprofit sector. Why? It ostensibly gives the Department of Treasury unilateral ability to label 501c3 organizations as terrorist supporting organizations and essentially revoke their nonprofit status. While there is a kind of very technical administrative redress process, rights groups are broadly critical of this bill for the potential for executive overreach and abuse across the political spectrum. Last week, we reported that the ACLU put out a letter with a broad coalition of nonprofits themselves criticizing this bill. George, also on a Friday, a letter put out by the Council on Foundations, Independent Sector, National Council of Nonprofits, and the United Philanthropy Forum also came out and opposed to this bill. So, George, it seems that the nonprofit sector is coalescing in opposition to this bill. Now, what happens next? So the bill last week failed. It failed to meet that 2/3 majority. But on Monday, the bill emerged after being reintroduced into the Rules Committee and is going to go up for a floor vote this Thursday. However, this floor vote on Thursday is a simple majority vote. That means that you don't need 2/3 any longer. You just need one more than the other team, and the bill then moves to the Senate. George, we talked about this last week. Democrats, 52 Democrats voted for this bill. If that same number of Democrats votes for this bill this time around, it will pass and go to the Senate. There is a grassroots advocacy kind of like emergency call your congressman type actions I'm starting to see pop up from the sector of people urged to call their congresspeople to vote against this bill. But George, it is right now an open question and very possible that this bill passes on Thursday. If it proceeds to the Senate, which is currently a Democrat-controlled Senate, but it would only be a simple majority there as well, I believe, and is quite possible to pass. So this is an all-hands-on-deck effort. Just wanted to provide this update to, I think, George, which is one of the most major pieces of legislation directly affecting 501c3 tax status organizations we've done since doing this podcast. At least, I've never seen a piece of legislation as explicit in this and its impact to the sector. So worth following this very closely.
And to be clear, maybe you can just help me, because I'm trying to process it. The piece that is objectionable is the fact that at present, you cannot affiliate or fund any terrorist organization. If money from your nonprofit has found its way there, like the IRS, this is already a thing that's in process, but it is a process controlled and governed by the IRS with regard to like removal of this. As I understand it, this basically takes that formal process of review and just says you can just sort of flip a switch. Is that right?
Yeah, George, that's pretty much exactly right. So basically, there's no due process in this. It's not the rejection of, of course we don't want nonprofits supporting terrorism. And it's worth noting this came out over complicated fights about, protest and activist groups in the context of protests over the war in Gaza. But the key piece here is that the Secretary of Treasury, him or herself, can unilaterally decide, hey, this organization supports terrorism. And all they need to do is notify that organization without evidence and immediately have their C3 status revoked. So the only thing it requires the government to do is to provide notice that they've in fact lost their status. There's no due process. There is a redress process. An organization can go through the RN and potentially try to challenge this. And I think go through, the bureaucracy of whatever that means. But George, as we talked about in the last show, the stripping of that status allows nonprofits to lose access to banking. They immediately lose their status, their ability to fundraise, right? For small and medium organizations that don't have the legal capacity to fight this or the tax knowledge to
So wait a minute,
this,
how does that freeze your bank account if you get reclassified? Don't you just sort of have to like re-up as a, an LLC or something, or a C Corp? Like, and that, or do they freeze your assets on the spot until that's settled?
I quite frankly don't know, George. I'll have to consult
I
the
don't know
specific
either.
legislation, but I think it raises a lot of questions, and we have a lot of advocates pushing hard against it.
Yeah, I mean, look, as a independent sector that supports like another branch of stability in our country, and also the fact that many news outlets are nonprofits, it just takes one, Fox and Friends noodle to say something that's like Trump is watching and suddenly calls up the secretary. Like the chain of events is not hard to imagine. Unfortunately, I don't see how this bill is stopped effectively.
No, George, I think that's a good point. And I think it's worth noting the eagerness with which the Republican-controlled House is willing to push through this bill is kind of a tip-off as to how they view it. And that's what I'll say on that.
Yeah. Well, so it begins. The first leg of the marathon, but it's take them seriously. Take them at their word. This is exactly what will happen. And organizations that live on the bubble, or even deal with immigration, like, oh, you're letting terrorists in. If you deal with immigrants, like, I would say, like, what is our actual mitigation strategy plan? Do you have a backup entity? Start talking to experts on, like, all right, this will happen with a likelihood of X. If you are a large enough immigration organization, what are your backups? How do you plan for that? There's ways around it. You can be a company and deal with it, but like, this is a weaponization of the designation of terrorism. We've all lived through this in the aftermath of 9/11, where we lost many rights, frankly, in terms of privacy, that were simply signed away with the Patriot Act. And I think this is like, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly looks like it rhymes here.